Hello and welcome to our next Plan Talk session. Before we kind of start, there's just a couple of bits of housekeeping. These sessions are about just a snapshot of an interesting subject that our kind volunteer speakers are talking on. Today is Mr. Kiely, who is the chair of POS, the Planning Officers Society. And has worked for a fair few of the local authorities across London, so you've got quite a bit of insight. I'm trying to remember all of them and I can't. Off the tops of my head, we've got Croydon, you've got Hammersmith and Fulham at some point. Go on, which other authorities have you worked for?
Lambeth, Bexley, Waltham Forest, Lambeth.
I was going to say, in your career, are you aiming for like the full 35 planning authorities?
I'm just about halfway through, yeah.
Well done. So in terms of the format of this, before I hand over to Mike, the first thing to say is on that side of the screen, there's a space for you to put your questions as we go through the presentation. Please do put your questions through, and I would do my best to make sure they all get answered. Mike's going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we've got time for about 15 minutes Q&A. You're not allowed to ask about specific development proposals that he was the case officer for, just so we're clear. So with no further ado, I will hand over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Peter. Okay, so today's talk is not about predicting or describing what the sort of plan tech world, the world of AI, big data is capable of. I think Ewan Mills is much more capable of doing that than me, and he did a similar one of these a few weeks ago. And in any case, my expectation of IT is that it's always over-promised and under-delivered. So I'd like to wait to see what plan tech actually does enable us to do in the future. But what I'm talking about today is designing, if you like, our analog system so that it is ready for that plan tech world. It's often referred to as Industry 4, 4.0, the fourth stage of the Industrial Revolution. The first stage was the change from hand production to machinery, driven by water initially and steam. And that took us up to the early part of the 19th century. And then in the second stage, the Victorians, and then later the Edwardians, took us through the sort of technology era, where sort of technologies advanced, things like the making of steel, the internal combustion engine, the invention of electricity, etc. And then the third age is the digital age, which is the sort of post-World War II, with the invention of the sort of modern computer, by Charles Babbage in Bletchley with the code breakers, and that whole era. But what we're now in is an age where we are increasingly connected. Everything, if you like, is a computer. Our fridge is a computer. And this sort of connected world of big data and analytics and artificial intelligence will drive our world like never before. The world of both work, rest and play. Or as I say, the B, C and AD use classes, given that I'm talking to planners. So what I'm doing today is to look at what might be round the corner in the context of the different types of development that we deal with and the way the planning system operates and the legislation behind that. So I'm going to look at three areas: the erection of new buildings, the extending of existing buildings, and I'll concentrate mainly on houses, but it would apply to any use in theory, and also the change of use of buildings and land, and particularly in the context of town centres. So the first area is new buildings, and I think what we're seeing coming through the system is a return perhaps to design codes, and it is how that way of dealing with new buildings could be facilitated. So I see there'd be two main drivers at work here. Off-site manufacture, I think, is something that we're going to increasingly see for a whole series of reasons. The industry needs to update itself. It needs to move into the sort of modern era of production. But the problem with off-site manufacture in the past is that although you can get very high production qualities, and you certainly can get economies of scale, but you only get those when you produce very, very high quantities. And that restricts variety. and that's tended to restrict it. But what I'm told is with BIM design technology linked to computer-controlled manufacture, and in some cases 3D printing, we could see a world where off-site manufacture produces the benefits of quality and low cost, but also a much greater degree of variety. So I think we're on the cusp of a revolution in that area. What is also likely to come down the line is a move to design codes. There are two recent publications, significant publications, that are very different, the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission and the Policy Exchange publication, Rethinking the Planning System for the 21st Century, two very, very different publications coming from two very, very different places, but both conclude more or less with a need for design codes or rule-based development control. So, as I say, I think design codes are set to be a future of the planning system moving forward. They have a long proven history. Much of the development that occurred in the past in the various sort of growth areas, Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian and interwar housing, were built using approaches that were very, very similar to design codes. And what government is suggesting is a light touch approval process to the principle of development, and then a fast track process for agreeing the design or a fast track consent process pushed or guided by design codes. And early indications from the Secretary of State in the Planning for the Future publication in March this year suggests that they are very much looking at this. So our proposal in this area is that the tool that we've got at the moment, permission in principle, should be expanded, and we think is the tool that we should use to deal with these types of developments using design codes. So the permission in principle should apply to all development types at all scales. Currently, it is just restricted to residential development of 10 units or less. And the advantage of the permission in principle is because it concentrates, the first stage, because it concentrates on the principle alone, it isn't bogged down by having to impose conditions. And this is the problem with an outline application, the current system that we have. The outline produces the planning permission, and therefore that planning permission must have all the conditions attached to it. You don't have an opportunity to attach additional conditions moving forward. And that drives unnecessary complexity at that early stage, which is why the outline proposal was criticised quite heavily, and why the origins of permission in principle in the Lyons review looked to have a simpler outline process. So our view is that if permission in principle was expanded and used for all types of development, the two-stage process of agreeing the principle and then dealing with the details later on facilitates the use of design codes. And you could possibly, moving forward, with a 3D mapping environment, with all the elements of design codes fully coded, and AI used either to create or test layouts, we may well have an approach that is not automated, perhaps, but certainly semi-automated as that technology advances. So our view is we need to put in place now, if you like, an analog version of this, so that we are able to use design codes as part of the decision-making process. Permission in principle can set the principle, and then the technical detail consent, guided by design codes, can simplify and speed up the final detailed decision part of the process. Extensions. We feel that it is possible to automate approaches to permitted development. And we think if local authorities' residential extension guidelines also became a form of permitted development, then we could revolutionise this part of the process. There's a lot of work going on at the moment with the sort of plantech label to give good advice in this area, and those are to be lauded. But we feel we can go further. We already have the technology really to do this. Certainly in London, with View City, we have a 3D fully rendered GIS world that is accurate down to 15 centimetres, 6 inches. And the probability is these will get even more accurate. Permitted development rules and national rules could be coded into a CAD or BIM type software. And if you linked the two, you can have a system where someone brings up their house in the planning portal with the interactive house that was on the last screen, but it would be their own house. And they could pull out extensions in the form that they wish to build, be they side extensions, rear extensions, roof alterations. And you could have a system where they're green whilst they're within the permitted development rules, and as soon as you go beyond that, it goes red. So a person can, in effect, design the extension that they wish to create, and you could produce a definitive certificate of lawful development on the press of a button. All this is technically possible because, if you like, PD is a set of code, and you can put that into these systems. To say, most LPAs have residential extension guidelines and other documents on shop fronts and similar sort of things, which sets out what is acceptable or not in their area. Most areas, particularly in London, have 2 or 3 or maybe 4 development eras. There's the Victorian terraces, there's the sort of Edwardian terraces, there's the interwar, semi-detached, etc. There's a limited number of house types within an area, and what you can do and what you can't do on those particular house types is set out in these guidelines. That can be coded in the same way. So you could produce similar guidance to the public on whether or not their proposals conform to these local sort of guidelines. But we think you can go further. So in theory, using that technology where people are pulling out what they want to do in terms of an extension, they could get their certificate, as I've already outlined. If it meets the residential extension guidelines, you could, on a press of a button, in theory, get a planning permission issued. Now, some people will say, well, what about consultations? But the reality is the residential extension guidelines have already been subject to consultation, and any further consultation, unless it draws up something unusual, if someone objects to something that meets the residential extension guidelines, that's not going to result in a refusal of planning permission. So I think there's an issue there that needs to be addressed, but I think it's possible with perhaps more extensive consultation on those guidelines, once they're set, to be confident that it's fair and proper for that to be a much more automated process. And then finally, if what someone wants to do exceeds those parameters, they can, again with the press of a button, submit an application for planning permission. So in order to make this potential a reality, we need to change what we do now. And effectively what we're saying is residential extension guidelines should, but there should be legislation that enables them to be a form of local permitted development. People might say you could do local development orders, but they are actually quite complex to draft. And that's why they're not used as extensively as perhaps they could do. But you could have a simple checking process for a scheme that's submitted that is purporting to be in line with the local development or local residential extension guidelines. That is checked as a simple process, and then the approval is issued as a consequence of that. So the final area I'd like to look at is changes of use, but particularly in the context of town centres. Really what we're doing here is questioning whether the use classes order is still the best way of controlling the differences between use classes. We want to propose that we test, and this does need much more work and much more debate, but we want to start off that conversation to test whether alternative approaches might be a better way of doing that. So just to remind everyone about the use classes order, in effect, this is a tool that we use to decide whether there is, in most cases, a material change of use. So in planning, you need planning permission if you carry out a material change of use, not a change of use. That change of use has to be material. And what the use classes has done is to group together uses that are considered to be so similar that any changes between them is not material and there isn't a need for planning permission. So it's codified in the use classes order. And I'm sure most of the viewers are familiar with various classes, so I won't go through them. But the differences between those classes is generally defined by some external impact that that group of uses have that's different to another group of uses. So it could be that it creates more noise or fumes, vibration. There's significant public activity. Traffic levels are different, or the type of traffic, heavy vehicles, is different. Sometimes it also goes to sort of policy issues. So an A1 shop is often considered better than an A2 type of use. So they're grouped into these classes. That makes sense. The externalities are what we're controlling. The question is, does that need a fundamental rethink? So in terms of our town centres, retail is going through really a radical transformation. The way we buy stuff has changed beyond all recognition. You know, we've seen that those changes occurring over recent years, over the recent decade. It's probably that change is probably going to be accelerated with the current crisis, and many retail businesses won't survive. Government's approach to this has been to deregulate, but I think we are concerned about whether that is the right answer, because I think it's certainly not the case that the market delivers where things are under stress and under pressure. And if you look at town centres that are successful and have been successful, then they generally have been very heavily managed, either by the owner of that centre or by a sort of bid or similar sort of associations, and in some cases by the local council, particularly where they have significant land interests. So we feel there is a vital need for town centres to be managed as they move forward, as they find a new role. And I think we can be more optimistic than pessimistic about our town centres, because for centuries they've existed, and they've been places where people congregate and where they sort of trade and commune. The current sort of retail domination of it is a relatively recent phenomenon, a couple of 100 years. So I think town centres will continue to have a role. It'll be far less based on retailing as we know it. Other things will need to be facilitated. I mean, what's going to be the future of 3D printing? I don't know, but it clearly will have a significant feature in terms of picking up stuff that is printed or in effect manufactured for you. So I think it's important that we manage our centres. They will be different. You know, an international centre like Oxford Street is very different from a metropolitan centre like Kingston, very different from the destination sort of centres like the Westfield and Hammerson type shopping malls, and again different from your local centres and the neighbourhood centres, and they all need their own approach. So we feel it's very important that that is a feature going forward. So we use sort of two terms here to, I think, summarise the problem: placemaking and place managing. Placemaking is what planning does. It's very good at that, or it certainly has the ability to be very good at that. But places also need managing going forward. And really, this talk is sort of questioning whether planning is the best tool for place managing. So when planning permission is granted, it lasts the whole life of the building. So a pub built in 1948 got a planning permission, and unless other things have been applied for, that still applies today, still controls its hours of use, etc. That pub will also need a license of when it can open and when it closes. And it is daft that we have two regimes, planning and licensing, both who deal with the same thing: when the pub shuts. And I think it's also true that what is the appropriate time for a pub to shut is related to where it is and what's around it, but it's also related to the way the pub is run and the type of pub it is. And planning can't really take those things into account, and licensing can do, or certainly to a large degree can do. So I think there is this overlap between planning and licensing. They are good at different things, and we feel that there is a need to review that and come up with a new regime that uses the best administrative tool that we have to control things and manage things in the right way. So our proposal is that if you take all the externalities that we seek to control between the use classes, but you control those through a revamped licensing permitting regime. So I'll give a simple example, which is the B use classes, just because there's just 3 of them and they're fairly straightforward. You know, light industry, general industry, and warehousing. So you could have a single use class, which is industry or workplace, whatever you wanted to call it. And in order to, and that would enable you to run any of those from a planning point of view. But in order to run a general industrial plant, you would need a license or a permit for the general side of the industrial process. So if it's creating noise, vibration, fumes, or whatever it is that takes it out of the light industrial class, puts it into the general industrial class, that would be dealt with separately through this permitting regime. And similarly with warehousing, you know, generally the concern with warehousing has been heavy goods vehicles, and from a planning point of view, concern that, you know, historically didn't provide much employment. That's not the case today. If you look at a robotized factory, probably very little employment. You look at an Amazon type warehouse activity, significant levels of employment, and probably not large amounts of heavy goods vehicles, lots of delivery vans. So I think what we're suggesting is that by isolating the externalities from the fundamental land use, you could have a system, both a planning system that's simpler and a permitting or licensing system that is much more focused on dealing with the impacts that activity has. And planning's not such a good tool for doing that. So that's in effect the process that we're suggesting should be looked at.
That's fantastic. You've covered a huge amount of ground there, Mike. It's really interesting. We've had quite a few questions that are really, I'm going to try and group again, because I think otherwise we'll end up exploring the nuances of the planning system at length. But I think there's the kind of music to my ears around the work that you think needs to be kind of led on AI. But some of the space that certainly some of the previous speakers have spoken about is the ownership of some of the data that goes around it. So I think my first real question is around, to try and combine them, is to ask who should own this data? Who should own, so say for example, the 3D piece you presented one supplier, and then that model you took off the planning portal, which is of course yet another private supplier. Is it something that should be in public ownership, or is it something that should be in private ownership?
I think it feels that it should be in public ownership rather than private ownership. I mean, it's a service that the council is providing because, as a nation, we've decided that decisions around development should be taken, you know, in a democratic way through a local planning authority, you know, whether that's a local council or some other organisation, and therefore those tools, I think it starts to become, it raises complexities when it starts to be sort of privately owned. So I think, but I think there are probably sort of blended models where some of the technology may well be produced by you know, small startup companies. But I think we're moving into the world of you know, these things are not, you know, it's not the sort of Microsoft and Apple model, but you know, there are other models out there, and it's not my area of expertise. But my understanding is that, you know, it's often called open source, and the internet effectively is run on open source software. It's not owned by everyone. So, you know, there are or it's not owned by anyone. It's, you know, so I think it's not really my technical area, but it feels intuitively that it's a public service and therefore shouldn't be privately owned.
I think there's just an interesting philosophy there that as a collective of planners we need to kind of get our heads around, isn't there? Because then it kind of leads on to the same kind of space of questions that a lot of the other speakers have been asked, which is around what skill sets are future planners going to need then? Are they the same as the current skill set, or are there kind of new things we're going to have to be able to do?
I think what we're proposing will produce possibly a new profession, in a sense, that will be whether it's a subset of planning or it's a breakaway thing from planning. So you would have the place making part of the planning process, which is very much about local plans and you know, strategic plans and granting planning permission at that sort of larger scale, and you know, for new development at all scales. But then that day-to-day management of places, that place managing role, would be, I think, either a much boosted and fairly significantly changed licensing regime, or some other sort of blend of the two, where you're issuing permits for activities that could have a negative impact on either people or places. But what we're suggesting is that should be a much more nimble system than a planning permission that waits for someone to apply for it. So I think, you know, the town centre management role will become a much more important, much more significant role, with a bunch of tools that enables that to be done. And one of the things I didn't touch on was that, you know, that should actually be driven by big data. You know, your decisions as a local authority in terms of what you do, what you promote, what you allow, what you resist in your town centre should be driven by empirical data. And that can be, so I'm told, almost in real time, but certainly much more efficient and up to date than the sort of rather sort of old data, even though it's only 6 months old or a year old, that we currently use.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. But that then leads to the impossible question, doesn't it? Which is, what in your opinion is the future role of the town centre then going to be?
There's stuff that we still got to go and pick up, you know, and so that, you know, there will be a, you know, residual sort of retailing element. There will be a need to, there's certain things, you know, you can't really buy a suit online. Well, you can in theory, but most, for those types of purchases, people will, there's a showroom type activity where you go along and you look at it, and you play with it, you feel with it, you try it on or whatever. So that sort of activity will continue. Clearly, you know, food and drink and leisure activities have been expanding and will continue to do so. But I think it's the town centre will be the place at different scales. There will be a sort of very nearby neighbourhood one, perhaps, but, you know, a local town centre plus all the bigger ones that offer bigger things, you know, your theatres and etc., where people go to commune with others. And I think, you know, we're all missing that during this sort of crisis, and very, very keen to get back to it. So, but I think that challenge and that change will need to be managed. It won't just happen. You know, if you deregulate your local centre, you'll end up with probably a lot of rubbish, as we're seeing in many areas. And if you want those to be attractive places for people to go to, then the local council and other partners, you know, the landowners, the bids, etc., will need to take this much, much more seriously than they have done in the past, and really work hard to make those centres a success and meet the needs of its population. And I don't think that's happened, certainly not extensively, and probably not happened to the degree it needs to up until now, other than in some exceptional areas.
So I've got two more kind of subject areas, so I'm going to just run over very quick slightly. The first one is, if your vision of, sorry, just to clarify, your vision of planning is that it becomes much more about management of space over time, rather than the high jump scenario where we assess development proposals at that split moment as we're making the decision, will the planning system need a whole new set of tools available to it? Like the ability to revisit conditions, the ability to revisit obligations and things like this?
No, I don't. I'm not so much that it needs a whole new set of tools, but I think the way you will deal with a planning application for a new building or a new, area, a new housing development or whatever it might be, will clearly be informed by the fact that there is this new regime that will be managing those externalities. So, I mean, if you take what I've sort of suggested, you could end up with just 4 use classes. All the A's and D2 as a town centre activity, all the B's as an employment use class, all the C's as a residential use class, and the sort of D1 institutional, public institutional one. You could end up with that, with all the variations that exist in the current use classes, managed through permitting, licensing type regimes. Yeah, I've done an analysis of all of those, all the differences, and they can all be managed in that sort of way. It's a fundamentally different licensing or permitting regime, but it is all possible. But if those are capable of responding to stuff, be it the person who's running the operation, the way a place has changed, or the way generally expectations or technologies have changed, then you can issue new permits and withdraw permits. Planning can't do any of that. So with that in place, your planning permission would have far less conditions on it relating to the control of the development once it's built. So it will be concentrating on the building, what it looks like, etc., and how it functions as a machine, if you like, as a structure and a and far less about the operational activities, because that will be dealt with differently.
That'll be regulated.
And the importance is it will be done at the point in time it needs to be done. Going not this sort of notion of the pub granted permission in 1948 and that's your one chance forever until someone asks you to vary a condition or what have you.
It's a subject I could explore for weeks. So yeah, I think it's really interesting. I'm really sorry we've got to bring it to close, but I do have yeah, I'm not sure I can recover from the last hangover, but yeah, let's do that. And then I think there's just one other question, which is the one we've asked everyone, which is really, what advice would you give to people kind of entering the industry now, given that we are going to be entering into some economically challenging times over the next year or so too? What advice would you give to people coming into our profession?
I think I would encourage people to come into the profession. I think it's a fantastic job. You get to create. If you're working in whatever place you're working in, you are in effect creating the new version of that for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And when I do member councillor training on planning committees, I mean, I say to them, and in all seriousness, that what they're doing on planning committee is the most important thing that the council does, because if they get it right, everything else is a whole lot easier. If you have a place that's beautiful, to use the current parlance, that is economically successful, where it functions well, then all the issues that councils have to deal with in terms of adult social care, education, etc., are all a lot easier than a place which it does not function well, has not been well planned. So I would say it's the best job in the world, and jump on in.
Well, I can't disagree. Well, thank you so much. We've actually covered everything that we've been asked. So thank you so much for your time. It's really appreciated, and I know there'll be a lot of interest in watching this one again. You've covered some really new and innovative ideas about how the planning system could operate, and I'm really pleased that you've suggested it all should be data-led. So it only leaves me to say we will be putting this video on YouTube shortly. If you just go onto YouTube and look up hashtag plantalk, you'll be able to find it. And also to say thank you to Natalie and Lucy, who made all the magic happen. So thank you.